Hi, I'm Heather Stephenson, and I am the Employee Assistance Program Manager here at King County. I'm here to talk with you today a bit about domestic violence and workplace violence. Today's objectives is to provide knowledge of the prevalence of domestic violence and workplace violence, review the policies and expectations for supervisors and leaders, to discuss steps to create a safe working environment for all. So here we have the definition of domestic violence or intimate partner violence per the bulletin on domestic violence here at King County. So as you can see, it includes things like physical harm, bodily harm, assault, or using threats to inflict fear of assault. It can mean it can include physical assault of a family member or a household member, a pattern of behavior in which a family member or household member or someone in a dating relationship uses violence, coercions, threats, intimidation, isolation, and emotional abuse, as well as sexual or economic abuse to control or change the behavior of another family member, as well as stalking. A person from the same household. And by stalking, we mean multiple events where a person is continuing to show up, perhaps uninvited or after they've been told not to follow someone, things of that nature. You can look at the exact RCW that gives the stalking definition. It's here on the PowerPoint, but thinking about how that might impact. The other things to think about is that this definition, although is pretty comprehensive, it does not include everything. Many times we have heard stories of EAP of partners who are using threats to harm themselves, harm children, or harm pets or other family members in as a way to change a behavior or manipulate the person. So, thinking about what domestic violence or intimate partner violence looks like and how that can impact our employees. It's really important when we think about these things to understand that it's not always one thing or another, and that there could be actions outside of this listed definition that definitely would qualify as intimate partner or domestic violence. The prevalence is really important to understand as we look at things like intimate partner violence, because 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims at some point of physical violence, and 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe physical violence by an intimate partner within their lifetime. So we have multiple employees here, and many of them have experienced this at some point in their lives. And that impacts them in some way, shape, or form. And it may be before they come to King County, it may be while they're employed at King County, or it may happen after their employment with King County. But we can help impact and help provide supportive, healthy spaces for our current employees. And if someone who's had previous domestic violence, we have supportive options so that individual can help heal from that trauma. There's also things to consider as far as um, how and where domestic violence occurs. How does that impact different communities, especially when we think about the LGBTQ men and that. A majority of homicide victims were identified as gay. It's 46.6 and 28.6 were lesbian. That they were victims of intimate partner violence when there's homicide. So these things can lead to life or death situations. And it's important that we as supervisors and leaders understand the impact that this has and how to help support. Here's a little bit more information of how we break down the statistics on intimate partner violence. We can see again, you know, that it can be broken down by race and ethnicity. We also can see that It can be broken down by orientation. So this doesn't have the full gamut of different orientations here, but of the ones that were available. This data is a bit older from 2018. Um, so thinking about that, as well as you can see here that it does occur across income. So different socioeconomic levels have different impacts on domestic violence. As you can see, lower as well as higher levels of income have more prevalence of domestic violence. So it can happen to anyone at any time. So thinking about that. So, what can supervisors and leaders do? Well, one, if someone comes and tells you that they're having some issues, please listen, ask some questions, and understand that you do not need to do this all on your own. A great way to do is to consult with the EAP to talk about what are issues, how can we help support this person, what is available. Some of the things that we think about and talk to leaders about when we're dealing with domestic violence is creating a safety plan for the employee at work. Um, Thinking about, can we change the employee's work site or work times, other options to disrupt the employee's normal schedule. And we want to disrupt that normal schedule, not because we want to cause undue harm or make life difficult for the person who's experienced domestic violence, but we want to disrupt it so that it is not a normal pattern and that the person who is abusive in that relationship can't rely on normal patterns to seek out and potentially harm the employee or other employees in that area. Again, there could be times where there is an imminent danger or threat. You know, someone comes in and says, "Hey, my partner and I are not in a good space, and things have gotten violent, and I'm worried that my partner may come to work to try to harm me. So, what should we do in those situations?" Thinking about how we create safety for all. It may be that a 911 call to involve police could be an option, but there are also some issues around that, especially for our employees who are BIPOC folks. So whether you are working with someone who is a BIPOC person, the partner who is abusive is a BIPOC person, or you have BIPOC people in the workplace that could be impacted by police coming. It's really important to kind of think about that and how do we create safety for all? Is it that we help that employee who's directly experiencing the violence to go to a shelter? Do we help by getting our security involved early so that they know not to allow this person on site? How do we create some space for safety for everyone? There's not always a number one rule or best way to do these things sometimes. It's looking at the case by case and having conversations with that individual. That might be a great way to involve EAP because sometimes these conversations can be difficult, and we at EAP are very well versed in having these conversations. We can talk with someone, help them identify what might be the safest option. But we also recommend that you, as supervisors, take some time and really think about the needs of you and your team at any given moment, whether you're in the office or hybrid or remote. What does that look like to help provide safety for your team in an instance of domestic violence? Things to also consider is there a protection order or will the employee get one? And there are definitely some positives that can help provide some protections. And at the end of the day, it is simply a piece of paper. So it can do some things, but it definitely have its limits. And even getting a protection order can be difficult and triggering and traumatizing. So, we may want to be helping our employees and offer them as an option. Have you thought about an order of protection? And here's how it can help in the workplace. But understand that ultimately that decision is up to the employee on whether or not they're going to engage with that process. And we, as supervisors and leaders, have to respect that person's ability to make the best choice for them at any given moment. Things to also consider, things about granting leave, unpaid or paid, which is available through the domestic violence guidelines, thinking about temporary leaves of absences or leave of the area, making other interim arrangements to create a safer workplace in situations. So perhaps if someone works at a front desk, maybe it's simply offering them a office space that is not up front. So if their abuser does show up, they have some time to be intercepted before that individual is seen. So thinking about that and what could work for your workplace. Sometimes it's allowing the person to work remotely, especially if they are choosing to leave the home and go stay with someone else or in a shelter. That may be an ability, an option to really consider and work with the employee. For some employees, that's not going to be helpful. That's not an option that's really going to be supportive of their needs. So again, it's really important to think of individual needs, and that's a great place to have EAP partner with you in these options. Things to consider. First and foremost, you really should take a moment and think about the power dynamic that exists between a supervisor and a direct report. With domestic violence, it is all about power dynamics. And so you, as a supervisor, can have a lot of impact on someone, and it can also be potentially harmful. So, thinking about giving advice, saying things like, well, I would just leave, I wouldn't stand for that. um, Gosh, why wouldn't you just go to the police and get help? Um, and those things aren't always helpful. We don't always understand all the complexities of what's going on in someone else's home. There are definitely cultural issues and concerns that may impact it, different religious thoughts and different cultures, like I said, could have an impact on how a person thinks about relationships and domestic violence. And so saying something like, I would just leave or I wouldn't stand for that may be a very true statement for you, but it is a lot more complex. And especially in your role as a supervisor or a leader, you hold a lot of power, and potentially that person may choose to do that action because of your advice and not of their own will. We really want to empower employees to make the best choices for them, and that they're the ones making those choices. So, thinking about that. Also, consider confidentiality and how good intentions could be re traumatizing for individuals that are experiencing domestic violence. One of the things that I've seen here at King County is that sometimes we get these very long email chains that have very intimate information about someone. And when we think about trying to help and support, yet we pass on a lot of information, we're doing that out of our best intentions. We're trying to help and support, but really being conscientious of, does everyone need to know that level of information? And can we maybe restart a new email chain or a new email when we need to reach out? How do we protect that person's confidential information? Sometimes with domestic violence, it can be really, the amount of information that can be provided can be really personal. And there are a lot of different emotions and experience that happen for individuals who are experiencing domestic violence. Thinking about the cyclical nature of domestic violence, we know research has shown again and again that there is a cycle of domestic violence. It starts off with kind of what we call the honeymoon phase, where everything is going well. Um, the person who may become violent is usually relatively charming. They may do things like send flowers or gift giving, make promises, things like that. And then there's some sort of event that occurs that triggers a violent response, whether that's verbally manipulating the person, whether that's physical violence, sexual violence. It all kind of varies depending on where the person is at. And it creates an event, and then there is kind of a cool off phase that then goes back into a honeymoon phase. Maybe at some points during that after that domestic violence event where the violence occurs, maybe someone decides to leave the relationship, the home, for a short amount of period, but then maybe there's contact that comes back. You hear things like, "I'm so sorry, I would never do that again. I just got so angry," or "You made me just so angry. And so if you don't make me angry anymore, I won't harm you." And then the honeymoon phase comes back. You get the gift giving. You get you're the most important person in my life. There's a lot of manipulation that can happen. But we as individuals, we want to be connected. We are social beings, and our desire to be loved and be part of a family or part of a unit can really make decisions that aren't always in our best interest. And knowing that domestic violence is very cyclical, it recurs and sometimes can get worse, it can be very difficult to help support, especially if you don't understand the nature of it. If you've never experienced it or have worked with someone who has experienced it, it can be really easy to say, I just don't understand why you would continue to put yourself in that situation. But that doesn't necessarily help the employee. So we need to kind of try to think about each individual event of domestic violence and treat it somewhat separately. And that's where your own personal thoughts and experience with domestic violence can impact how you relate and interact with someone. If you've experienced domestic violence or intimate partner violence, how you may react may be different than someone who has not. And what are your thoughts, and how are you bringing that into the situation? Be thinking about that. Think about if you think about it now versus when you're faced with that situation, you may have some more insight on how best to support your employees. And lastly, think about, how do you know if something is different or wrong or not going well with your employees? One of the best things that you can do as a supervisor is know your employees so that you know when something's not quite right. And if you build that relationship with the person, it is easier to go up to them and say, "Hey, you don't seem your normal self right now. Is everything okay?" And check in. You may be able to help support the employee at a level where violence can be avoided or the impact on work can be avoided. We can help provide space and help reassure employees that their employment isn't going to be at risk because they're experiencing domestic violence. One thing that abusers can do, and we've worked with many employees who've had this experience, is the abuser will tell their partner, if you ever leave me, or a similar threat, I will ruin you. I will make sure that you lose your job, so you'll have no money, so you have to depend on me. So if we know something's not quite right with our employees and we've built some relationships and trust, and be able to have a conversation with them at maybe the beginning when we first notice that something's maybe not normal with that person, we may be able to help them find spaces to make room for them to move forward in a healthier manner. Something to consider as well is that statistically, and research has shown, the most violent and deadly time during a domestic violence relationship is when someone chooses to leave. That is where things become deadly. And so that is definitely something to consider and know when working with someone experiencing this. The other piece to kind of think about, we've talked mostly about so far what happens if the employee is the person experiencing the victim, but what about if the employee is a perpetrator or is accused of being a perpetrator of domestic violence? Again, our suggestion of seeking safety for all is definitely first and foremost. And if imminent danger is there, thinking about that ahead of time so that you're not in the moment having to make some of those really difficult choices. And know that you can contact 911 for police intervention, but understand there is definitely some risks there. And so, what would that look like for you? Um, Take practical steps to provide safety and look at different places within the workplace and the workplace violence policy or the domestic violence policy to really think about how that might impact the workplace. And if there's reason to be considered that a crime has committed, then we may need to get police involved and cooperate to whatever extent necessary with the police investigation. You may also contact the prosecuting attorney's office for some support on that and guidance. Um, Also, would highly recommend that you reach out to your HR department, especially if there's an issue or concern that we may need to do an internal investigation on things like if we believe that King County resources have been used or utilized to um, abuse someone, we may need to look at that as a policy violation. There could be other policy violations as well when we have an issue of domestic violence where we're working with an employee who's accused of being a perpetrator or um, announces it, provides that information. And ultimately, there may be a need for discipline or corrective action. This is also a great space to be contacting EAP. We can help walk you through what are the next steps, what do we need to do, how do we move forward. And there are mental health services for perpetrators of domestic violence so that they can learn and grow and find different ways of coping you know, do different activities other than lashing out violently. It's also important to remember that that employee is owed some level of confidentiality. Again, we don't want to have this big long email chain detailing everything that goes out to lots and lots of people. Yes, it's important to seek consultation, but think about if you were in that person's shoes, would you want that many people to know everything about what was going on? And how do we treat that person with respect and dignity as we're going through a process? Just because someone gives an allegation doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It doesn't mean it's also it could absolutely be true and valid. So we have to kind of sit on this space of both places. We owe confidentiality to the person experiencing domestic violence as well as someone who may be a perpetrator. Thinking about how that may change your relationship and working with that individual if they do disclose something like that can be really important so that we make the correct steps to help support the individual as well as maintain our workplace safety. So allegations are not proof of misdeeds, and it needs to be investigated before we move forward with any sort of discipline. And that's where it's really important to think about how your thoughts of domestic violence and of people who are domestically violent can impact that relationship and those discussions. Creating a safety plan for all, including the employee who is accused of domestic violence, is really important. And knowing, again, how your experiences of domestic violence or thoughts on it could impact your relationship with that person. So, moving away from domestic violence, let's talk now about workplace violence. Here we have the definition of workplace violence. It is somewhat similar in some spaces and somewhat different in other spaces as domestic violence. You can see it does include any physical assaults, threatening behavior, verbal threats in a workplace setting that can be perpetuated by strangers, customers, or clients, coworkers, personal relations, or other non-employees doing business for or with King County. And it's included to verbal violence, which is verbal threats towards a person or property, such as being sworn at or shouted at, obscene phone calls, physical violence, actually harming, hitting, kicking, pushing individuals. Using dangerous weapons such as explosives and firearms, blades, knives, that kind of thing, which are prohibited from being on a person for King County unless it is required by their jobs to be armed. Then they should not be armed while at work. Again, we have stalking here, which is that someone is intentionally and repeatedly harassing or following another person. The intention a lot of times is to put fear in the person, and so really looking at that. And we don't always know people's intentions, but it's also looking at the impact of that behavior, thinking about that, and feeling of fear, trying to use circumstances to frighten, intimidate, or harass a person. Thinking about those definitions, of course, I didn't read everything word for word, but there could be other things that could be considered workplace violence. Again, just like with domestic violence. So, really thinking about, and if an employee comes to you and says things like, I just don't feel safe around that person, asking what does that mean, not assuming that we know what that person means. Is it that you don't feel safe speaking up, and why is that? Is it that you feel like you're not being heard or listened to, or it's emotionally exhausting and therefore you don't feel safe talking around this person? Is it because they've threatened that person or used their size or body to intimidate? What is going on? So, best thing to do in either a domestic violence or a workplace violence situation is to get curious and ask questions and seek consultation. Here's some prevalence information on workplace violence. These are from 2017. That people who experienced trauma from workplace violence, 70% were female, 67 were between the age of 25 to 54. 71 worked in the healthcare or social assistance industries. So, thinking about how your industry, your line of business can impact those, your employees and those that you work with, does have an impact. And 18% required 31 or more days away from work following an incident to recover. And 25 involved 3 to 5 days away from work. So really thinking about these type of incidents can have a really big impact. Um, Here are some statistics as far as homicides in the workplace. Um, People who died from workplace violence in 2017 were 82% were male. 48% were white, 64% were aged between 25 and 54, and 21% were working in a sales or related occupation. 19% were performing protective service activities. So there are some, again, where you work, what type of work you do can have an impact. There's the link down here at the bottom to the CDC if you'd like to learn more about that and where these numbers are coming from. So, when we're talking about workplace violence, it's important to know some of the signs here of people who may become violent in the workplace. Now, I do kind of give the warning that just because one or multiple signs are there does not necessarily mean that someone's going to become violent in the workplace. However, if you are seeing these signs, it is good to, one, be checking in and provide some early interventions. If we can, again, work with an employee who is showing signs or possible signs that something's not right or not going well for them to find alternative options. We can impact the changes and impact workplace violence. So when we look at things like excessive alcohol or drugs use, we do have a drug-free workplace policy that both EAP and our drug and alcohol program help administer. So if you have any questions there, either one of those, either us at EAP or drug and alcohol program, can be great to talk with. We have options to help support our employees. If there's unexplained absenteeism, again, a change in behavior or decline in job performance could be indicative that something's going on and we need to get curious and try to check in. Um, Things around depression. Now, not everyone who is depressed will become violent in any way, shape, or form. However, it could be, again, just a warning sign. And again, just because someone is having suicidal thoughts or comments doesn't mean that they're going to actually harm themselves or others, but it does mean we do need to do something to address that. And contacting the EAP can be really helpful to kind of flesh out and do a suicide or homicide assessment with a person there. The other thing is if you do have someone in your office who is talking about suicide and you need immediate support, EAP, we may not always be available 24/7. So the best place to call is the Making Life Easier number if you are having immediate concerns for someone's safety due to suicidality. And that number is 1-888-874-7290. They have counselors available 24/7 that can do crisis appointments on the phone to do some suicidality assessments. Definitely then worth a follow-up conversation with EAP. We can talk about how to help support the employee and anyone who may be impacted by hearing an employee voice their suicidal ideations. Someone who's constantly and persistently complaining about how they're being unfairly treated at work, having some violations of policies, having really strong emotional responses to criticism or mood swings, or even having some paranoia could all be signs, again, that someone may become violent, but is not necessarily, a one-for-one kind of situation. So if you see these things, part of it again goes back to knowing your employees so that you can tell when someone is maybe having a mood swing or some difficult times. So what can supervisors do? Again, know your staff and listen to your staff's concerns. If someone says, I feel unsafe at work, ask more questions to try to understand. At EAP, we see people on a variety of different things. And I have heard from employees that they've talked to supervisors and said, I don't feel safe with this person, and haven't always felt like they were heard by their supervisors. So, really important to be conscientious of how we're working in that moment. Just because you've never had an issue with a person doesn't mean that there isn't an issue. I've heard, oh, that's just Bob. He gets cranky sometimes, or um, that's just how Sari responds. And thinking about what that says and what that does to the employee that's come to you. It takes a lot to come to a supervisor to say, hey, I don't feel safe. And if that's the response that people get, although it's really well intentioned, it can do a lot more harm. And so, if our goal here is to intercede as early as possible, try to get yourself to recognize when you might say, oh, that's just how so and so is. Or "Oh, I've never had that experience with so and so. I can't see them acting that way." Understand that just because you've never seen them act that way doesn't mean that they're not capable and that this person's experience is different than yours. Both of those can be very true and hold at the same time, even though they may be in conflict with each other. Document, 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 write it all down. Make sure you get it correct. Ask the person who's coming in to say, hey, I don't feel safe, or I'm concerned, or this is happening. these are the things that I've written down as your concern. Did I get them right? Is there anything I'm missing? Things like that can be really helpful. And if someone says something and they say, that made me really uncomfortable, or I'm really upset by that, or I don't, that made me feel unsafe, and it's not making sense in your head on how that could be offensive or um, it make someone uncomfortable or feel threatened, ask. Simply say, I think I might be missing something. Can you help me understand um, how that impacted you and what did that mean to you? To get their side, to really understand, to make sure that you're hearing their concern fully. Again, consult with EAP or HR. EAP is always available to help, but we are seeing people and in meetings, so sometimes we're not again available in that moment. If there's an immediate concern, considering if it's a mental health concern or crisis, you can again call the Making Life Easier number for support in the moment. Call HR, call EAP, see what works. Consider having a safety plan that meets your employees' needs. What does that look like? We practice things for earthquakes and fire drills. What happens if we had a workplace violence situation? Someone came into the workplace and was threatening or had a weapon. What do we do? Is there a code word? How do we test to make sure our PA announcements work? Who calls who? Who does what? How do we leave? The safety team has some great trainings on active shooter um, scenarios and situations that I highly recommend. They can also talk to you about different safety plans in regards to this, but coming up with that safety plan for your office space, what does it look like and can you practice it? What would that look like to practice it so that you know? If you do practice it, understand that that could be triggering for some employees. It can be, it can bring up difficult emotions and experiences. So remember that, maybe have conversations with your staff beforehand so that it's not a surprise, that everyone knows what we're doing and why we're doing it. So thinking about action plan items, things that you can do after this training. Again, thinking about what is your safety plan? What challenges do you have in your area? What type of dangers or risks do you have? And how might that differ from work site to work site? Someone who drives a bus is going to have a different working environment and different risks to both workplace violence and domestic violence than, say, someone who is working in the prosecuting attorney's office or at one of our health clinics. Or at one of our parks. So, thinking about how your environment and your workplace can impact both domestic violence and workplace violence and the type of safety plans that are available to you. And again, how do you communicate with your staff, especially if they are out in the field, if not everyone is there? How do we get that information out? Who do we contact? Do you know the security's dispatch line? And where is that information kept so that if you, as the supervisor, are not there, there are other people around that know the plan and know how to react and can step in to those spaces? Other things for food for thought, again, thinking about how your thoughts, experiences, potential bias, especially when we think about racial bias, how that may impact when it comes to dealing with domestic violence, how your ability to how that might impact your ability to help an employee who's struggling with domestic violence. Um, how would you react to someone who disclosed that they are an abuser versus someone who is experiencing the abuse? Um, Is that a different experience for you? How do you work with each of those individuals? What comes up for you? Those gut reactions, those gut thoughts, it's important to acknowledge them and sit with them and then ask ourselves, is that the reaction or experience I want to provide? And if it's not, how or what is that reaction or experience we want to provide? How is the best way to support our employees, regardless of where they're coming from? Thinking about a scenario maybe to think through is an employee who has had a history of policy violations, mostly for attendance, comes to your office and tells you that they're having a hard time with another employee. The employee states that they feel unsafe at work and doesn't know what to do. What should you do next? Does the policy violation history impact this situation? And how so? Does it impact how you talk with that person, how you engage? But think about those things. Another situation to think about, a staff member who you have a great working relationship comes to you and tells you that they're in trouble and they've been charged with domestic violence outside of work. What things do you need to consider? How may this new information affect your relationship with the employee? What safety planning steps could you think about? What resources could you reach out to for support? A really important thing on this particular number here is that with the new King County domestic violence policy, that there could potentially be some discipline that could occur for issues that occurred outside of the workplace. So looking into getting that information or reaching out to HR so that they can do an investigation and see if there are policy violations. Really important to do that. If you can take nothing else from this space and you hear two things, it would be one, consult with others. You do not have to do this on your own. Most of the time, there is time to have conversations. And two, think about what it is that you want to do in these spaces, how you can react, and how you can create safety for all in your workplace given these different situations. If you think about those two things, you will most likely be in a better situation. Who are you going to reach out to? How do you make sure you do that? And how do we create safety for all? Those are really important pieces. A lot of that you can start thinking about ahead of time. It may not always be comfortable to think about these things, but it's really important to do so. Here are some resources that may be helpful for you as you think about these different situations. Again, we have the EAP number. We have a centralized one phone number that you can reach out, and it does ring at all EAP staff's desks so that we have a better chance of reaching you in the moment, as well as our email. So, again, if it's something that is emergent and urgent, maybe email may not be the best choice. You can also, I am the different EAP practitioners that we have on staff if you're needing some support. And there's the Making Life Easier program number as well, again, for mental health crisis situations. If you have any further questions after going through this training today and or want to talk with EAP on what could you do, what does safety for all in your particular area mean or look like, if you go, I am thinking back to some situation that has occurred recently, and maybe I need to go back and review that and ask some more questions, but I'm not really sure how. Feel free to give us a call. We're more than happy to talk with you as a supervisor and leader, go through the different steps, talk about what might be available to you. Um, as always, consulting is a great opportunity to get someone else's input, a different pair of eyes that may be a little bit removed from it. And it's definitely something that we at EAP do on a semi-regular basis. Luckily, we don't have to do it often. Thank you so much for your time and listening to me today, and take care.